Hi there, welcome to Precon Recon, where we take a look at the data behind pre-constructed commander decks to see which cards players are most commonly cutting from their precons, what cards are they usually keeping, and what are the most popular cards that players are adding to their precon to make it even more impactful. We're taking a look here at Lorehold Legacies, the deck led by Osgir the Reconstructor and also including Alibu Ancient Witness. This is a fascinating exploration into new territory for red and white, and the numbers definitely agree. Osgir is the runaway favorite from the Strixhaven pre-constructed decks because he's such a crazy cool new and original value engine. He is about 5 times more popular than Alibu, so most of the swaps that we'll see here will apply to Osgir rather than to Alibu, but they're very fascinating upgrades regardless of which commander you're interested in. First, let's get acquainted with some of the core cards from the pre-constructed deck that players are keeping in their decks because they are crucial to its strategy. Stuff like Archaeomancer's Map, Battle Mage's Bracers, and Cursed Mirror are all sticking around from the precon because they are really great value engines. And that's one of the coolest things to see from this deck, in my opinion. A lot of the times when it comes to original designs in the 99 for pre-constructed decks, some of them tend to be cool but lackluster, and they just end up on the cutting room floor. But that isn't the case here. These are really cool cards that the deck wants to keep around because they are not just interesting, but also pretty darn good. That's even the case for some of the powerhouse new finishers that we've got. Bronze Guardian and Triplicate Titan are also sticking around in the deck because they're a great way to get a bit more oomph in the late game, especially when we can make multiple copies of them. It's not just the new cards though, there are plenty of really great reprints that the deck is happy to keep around as well. Stuff like 1000-Year Elixir, for instance, is a great way to give Osgir multiple activations a turn. And then there's Halkite Tyrant, which we love to see here to steal other people's artifacts, which we can sacrifice for our own benefit, or potentially even win the game. I mean, it's outlandish, but it's exciting to try. And there's Idol of Oblivion, which we love to see here as a great way to get additional card advantage, or making multiple copies of this, which are themselves tokens, so they fuel their own ability. That's wild. Then there are role fillers like Duretti Scrap Savant, who's an amazing card advantage engine. Even though we are discarding cards and remaining card neutral in hand, we're able to take advantage of the stuff that ends up in the graveyard with our commander, so it doesn't even feel like we've really lost out on anything there, we've just gained more value. And also, Dispatch is one of my favorite exile spells that is right at home in an artifact deck. Osgir's value engine frankly runs the gamut in tons of amazing ways. There's always something to do. You can tap your mana rocks for mana, sacrifice them, and use any mana to create multiple copies of them right out of the graveyard, and then end up net positive on mana for future turns, which is a really awesome play pattern. Even just a simple Ichor Wellspring is a great card to abuse by getting in and out of the graveyard multiple times, or just making copies of that for a quick boost of cards, all for just a 2-mana rock. A simple card like Sculpting Steel is a great holdover from the precon because you can copy the little stuff, or you can copy some sincerely big stuff too. And speaking of big stuff, how have I not yet mentioned Mere Battlesphere and Combustible Gear Hulk? If you've ever faced down multiple copies of these cards, you know how much trouble that can be. This deck has crazy tons of potential. The last comment I want to make about cards that players are keeping from the original precon is the card Monologue Tax. This is an interesting one that I've already commented on in a previous Osgir video, which you can check out on this channel, but suffice it to say that I think that this card might be a little bit out of place in this deck. I'm not going to say that it's like a horrible card, and I'm not going to say it's the best thing ever. Players have certainly had mixed results with it, but here I just think that it is an enchantment source of ramp, when really we could probably make better use and abuse more if it was an artifact source of ramp instead. So swapping this out for really cool mana rocks or other just really cool artifacts in general might be a better fit for us, and this could be a card that we extract and put into other white decks instead. Now, despite the high number of original cards that players are keeping from the precon, and a great number of awesome reprints that players are happy to hold on to as well, there are still plenty of cards that players are cutting to make room for spicier upgrades as they begin to tune things up. So let's get to some of those now. What are the cards that players are most often cutting from this deck? The first things we see are a couple of pump-up effects on non-artifact creatures. Horde Smelter Dragon, Hellkite Igniter, and Jorkadin the Prevailer are all getting cut from 81 to 66% of the precons, and I think for good reason. Though these pump-up effects are really cool, the fact is that they're attached to non-artifact cards, which our commander can't duplicate or take better advantage of. So even though it's neat and there is a lot of potential here, they just don't really need to stick around when we could get some of these similar benefits on artifact cards instead. The same ends up going for Pia Nalar and Lelia the Blade Reforged. Again, while interesting, 73 to 62% of players are cutting them because the synergies are there, but not as potent as they could be. It looks like players also want to optimize some of the mana rock options that we've got, so cards like Unstable Obelisk and Boros Locket are getting cut from over 3/4 of the decks out there, most likely to make room for better 2-mana acceleration instead. There are also plenty of artifact creatures that aren't sticking around in the deck for very long either. Over 2/3 of players are cutting the card Sanctum Gargoyle out of their decks, and over half of players are cutting out Pilgrim's Eye and Bosch Iron Golem. Their effects are neat, but probably a little bit too minimal compared to the artifacts that we could be making multiple copies of. Or in Bosch's case, it's not necessarily a minimal effect, but just a very mana-intensive one. This is a deck that can make a whole bunch of mana, but that's still a pretty big investment before the effects begin to actually pay out. The most interesting trend that I want to note about the cards that players are most commonly cutting out of the Precon is the ways that removal from the Precon is being handled. Chain Reaction, Excavation Technique, Dispeller's Capsule, Rip Apart, Return to Dust, and Darksteel Mutation are all being cut from 32 to 42% of the Precons. That is a pretty alarming trend. That's a lot of removal spells to be taken out of the deck. But I think basically players are not really satisfied with the reliability of these cards. A whole bunch of them, for example, are not artifacts. And again, we want to be able to abuse extra artifacts. So if we can get removal on an artifact source, that's something that our deck will be able to have better synergies with. And I expect that those are the types of cards that players are replacing for these. In the case of some that are artifacts like Dispeller's Capsule, that's just not a great rate. It's a lot of mana, even if this one is an artifact. And a bunch of the other ones are just a little bit unreliable. So take note that the removal suite from the original deck isn't really sticking around, and it seems to be one of the main categories that players like to upgrade. Now to the exciting part. Let's talk about the cards that players are most commonly adding to the deck. Right off the bat, we can see that there are some goblins who are really interested in tinkering up the deck a little bit more. Goblin Engineer and Goblin Welder are getting added to nearly half of all of these Precon decks because they are a great way to get artifacts into our graveyard, or even to get artifacts back out of them and to cheat around some mana costs. Speaking of cheating mana costs, Foundry Inspector is here to show up and make our artifacts a little bit cheaper to cast as well, so 50% of players are including him along with the festivities. I mentioned earlier that some mana rocks were getting cut out of the deck because players might want to optimize the mana base a little bit more, and it turns out that's totally true. Talisman of Conviction and Thran Dynamo are getting added to 33 to 42% of the Precons because they are a great extra way for, first of all, to get Osgir out earlier, or second of all, to get 2 copies of a mana rock that will collectively tap for 6. How about the removal spells? We saw players cutting a whole bunch of them earlier, so what are they exchanging them for? Well, the most popular removal spell that we're seeing players add to the Precon is, of course, Swords to Plowshares, and at a far less popular rate, but still noteworthy, is Generous Gift, which is another really great role filler, and then some board wipes that I'm really happy to see. Blasphemous Act is really efficient, and Austere Command has the potential to be very one-sided. This is the part where card prices do creep up just a bit though. Not crushingly expensive, but enough to clearly have an impact on players' ability to actually acquire these cards and put them into their Precon. For example, Mishra's Bauble is a great card for Osgir. 0 mana sacrifices itself right to the graveyard and we get to draw a card where our commander can then make 2 token copies of it for a quick burst of card advantage later, and all for 0 mana? That's amazing, and players are adding it to the deck, but not nearly as much as it should be because it's $4 to $5 to acquire. Phyrexian Triniform is another potential example here too, a $3 to $4 mythic or so that seems really happy to join the Triplicate Titan that's already in the deck. Rings of Brighthearth is another great shout here. What an amazing card that used to actually be very expensive, but was thankfully recently reprinted. Even so, it's still $5 to $6, but man would Osgir really like to have multiple activations of that ability to get copied. Like, holy crap. In fact, we can even make multiple copies of the Rings of Brighthearth. See, this deck is nasty! Then there's the $3 Kuldotha Forgemaster and the $6 to $8 Mystic Forge. These are a great source of advantage for an artifact deck. Kuldotha Forgemaster tutors out any artifact that we want from our deck and puts it right into play, and it fills our graveyard full of artifacts while it's doing that. That's awesome. And Mystic Forge is especially potent when we have an artifact cost reducer in play, allowing us to flip through multiple artifacts off the top of our deck for a huge explosion of card advantage. Then there are the sincerely expensive cards that players would definitely add to this deck a lot more if they were easier to get. Wormcoil Engine is a card that we've seen artifact decks abuse over and over and over again, but for good reason. It's such a cool output, especially when our deck cares this much about sacrificing artifacts or making additional tokens of things. Speaking of sacrificing artifacts, Krark-Clan Ironworks doesn't show up in nearly as many of these decks as it could because it's a very expensive card. And just talking about it being a sacrifice outlet for artifacts makes me giddy. There's so much we're able to manipulate with effects like these, especially when we've got so many cards like Wake the Past from the deck that can get all of the artifacts we've sacrificed right back out of the graveyard if we want. And finally, we have to give a huge shout to Anointed Procession. It's an enchantment in an artifact deck, but it absolutely belongs because you just have not lived until you've made 2 copies, which becomes 4 copies of Mirror Battlesphere, and all of their additional mirror tokens get copied up as well. The last card I want to note here that the data shows us some players are adding to their Precon, but not nearly enough, is a card I've mentioned before on a previous Osgear video, Pull from Eternity, which goes and grabs a card right out of exile and puts it back into our graveyard. So even if we've already made token copies of it with our Osgear ability, we can do it all over again. This is a really sneaky instant, and I mostly think that its numbers are being impacted by the fact that it's a slightly more obscure card, but rest assured that if this card has a home, it's definitely this deck. Let's round things out by taking a quick look at the swaps that players are most commonly making to the original Precon deck's mana base. Most of the stuff that players are cutting follows the typical fare that we've seen from cuts that we saw in previous Precons already. For example, Study Hall, Temple of the False God, the Campus, and the Cycling Lands are all getting cut from a third to over half of the Precon decks out there, because they're just not as exciting as they could be. A lot of the utility lands are tending to stick around though. Phyrexia's Core, for example, is definitely staying here to be a nice sacrifice outlet right there in the mana base for free. And when it comes to the cards that players are adding to the mana base, it again usually takes the form of utility lands. For example, Buried Ruin is a really fun one that players are adding pretty frequently because it's great to just get the artifacts right out of the graveyard to our hand instead of always needing to exile them with our commander. And even though this one's a bit more expensive as a card, Inventor's Fair is being added to a bunch of Osgear decks too, because it's nice to just tutor up any artifact we need whenever the need arises. But the thing that most interests me is the number of swaps that players are making to the mana base. The original deck came with 38 lands in it, but when we take a look at the data, the average Osgear player is running closer to 34. That's a pretty big disparity. I think mostly we can chalk this up to the fact that Osgear is really good at mana acceleration. He can exile mana rocks from our graveyard to get us ahead on ramp really efficiently, even using artifact lands to do it. So he probably doesn't need to be bolstered by a whole bunch of lands out there. But even so, take note of the fact that those are some substantially different numbers and try to find the number that feels most comfortable for your deck. So those are the most common swaps that we're seeing players make to the Lorehold Legacies Precon, and if you're interested in even further upgrades for Osgear in particular, make sure you check out the other videos we've got on this channel for an Upping the Average video on Osgear the Reconstructor as well. But now, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think about the cards that players are taking out of the Precon, the cards that they're keeping, and the cards that they're adding in? Are there any that you think players are missing? Other cards that they should definitely be including that aren't showing up in the data just yet? We'd love to hear from you. So leave your comments below, and we'll see you on the next Precon Recon.